Hi, my name is Cameron, also known as Venus Theory, and welcome back to PSP University. In this video, we'll be breaking down the different types of EQs and some case uses for each. In the previous video, if you haven't checked that out, we broke down EQ as a broad subject, examining the different controls and talking about some case uses for EQ inside of a mixing, mastering, and just general production situation. Let's begin by breaking down the most common type of EQ, which is a parametric EQ. Parametric EQs are the EQ we talked about mostly in the first video, which includes a cutoff, a Q or resonance control, and a gain, which is the boost and cut amount. Some parametric EQs go beyond this by also offering some different filter types like bell curves, notches, shelving filters, or even low pass and high pass filters with different slopes. These are really your meat and potatoes EQ and are used for a lot of different situations. These types of parametric and more advanced parametric EQs are well suited to just about any application inside of a mix, from your general low pass, high pass cleanup to overall tonal shaping and carving to more creative sound design applications. Next up, let's talk about semiparametric EQs, which are very similar, just a little bit different. Semiparametric EQs are very similar to parametric EQs, but they're often missing one parameter. This is usually the Q or resonance control, which means they have a fixed slope. These types of EQs are usually well suited to broad strokes when it comes to mixing, like boosting the high end or boosting the low end, and they might also feature a midband. These types of EQs are often very specially designed to offer a very musical response when they're used, which could mean they add a nice color, or they're maybe very transparent, and sometimes you might even use one of these EQs just to run the sound through without adding any processing at all because of the type of character they can add to your sound. Now, what about a graphic EQ? You may have seen one of these before, and they're a little bit strange looking compared to other EQs. A graphic EQ is a fixed set of bands with a fixed width that offer a boost and a cut. These can be used for mixing applications, and some of them are often very highly renowned for the sound they impart to a certain thing, but otherwise they're typically used for setting up a live playback system in a venue or even in a studio or home theater. They're great for balancing out the overall sound against the sound of a room to offer the best response and listening experience. Next up, we have MidSide EQ, which is a pretty unique thing. When it comes to the broad subject of EQ, we're looking at a sound as a buildup of a bunch of different frequencies, and we're treating this in kind of one way, where we're boosting or cutting, and that's about it. But MidSide EQ is a little bit different because it uses sound in a different way. If we think about a mix or a stereo sound not only as a range of frequencies, but a stereo range of frequencies where we have the mid channel and then the left and right channels, we can treat these independently. MidSide EQ is great for modern production, especially because it's very useful to help preserve the low-end mono compatibility for playback in a live situation or just mono compatibility in general. Some case uses for a MidSide EQ might be a modern rock drum mix or a very aggressive dubstep track where we want to cut out the low end from the sides. That way the mid is preserved and translates really well to a live application, a mono playback system, or just has maybe a bit more power in general without sounding overly wide and washed out. Another really common thing to use MidSide EQ for is adding a kind of fake stereo width to something. With MidSide EQ, we can lift up certain frequency ranges, but not do it across the entire stereo spectrum, but instead just on the sides, adding a fake stereo width and making things sound wider than they really are. And this is usually done on vocals on the high end to make them nice and wide and bright, or just adding some wide mid-range energy to something. Next up, let's talk about linear phase EQs a bit, because you've probably heard of these, but you may not be all that familiar of what they do or why you might need one. Linear phase EQs are a bit of a deep subject as to how they work and why, but the broad idea is that these are generally used for mastering or for sound design purposes to help preserve the phase of the signal. To put it simply, these EQs are specially designed to delay the frequencies so that it preserves their phase no matter how you adjust them. These EQs are generally really handy for things that really need to have their phase lined up very specifically, like the master of a track or a maybe very low-end signal inside of a sound design situation for film or TV. Finally, to cap this off, let's talk a little bit about dynamic EQ, which is a relatively recent development when it comes to music production. A dynamic EQ is a special type of EQ that's usually used to process a relatively surgical frequency area in a very special way. With a standard EQ, we boost or cut and we leave it at that. It doesn't ever change. We're just making one adjustment and it stays like that the whole time. And a dynamic EQ works a little bit differently in that it's not a really fixed thing. A dynamic EQ is sort of like a crossover between a compressor and an EQ, just in a very special way. A dynamic EQ is a lot like a multi-band compressor, just with unlimited bands. It's a little bit different, but what this means is that it doesn't really affect the phase of a signal, but it works in kind of a similar fashion. Once a signal crosses a certain level or threshold, the EQ will then apply a boost or a cut to it depending on how far it's crossed that threshold and the ratio. So it's very, very similar to a compressor, just a little bit different. And because these are used in kind of a softer way than you might do with a multiband compressor, this doesn't really affect the phase relationships as much, making them really useful for a lot of subtle tonal balancing. Dynamic EQs are really unique and can be a lot of fun to experiment with, but these are great to use as a de-esser type of tool, maybe to fix some resonances if there's maybe a bit of mud in a certain frequency area, or other tasks like that where there's just something that kind of bothers you about a sound, but scooping it out or boosting it too much just doesn't quite work. With all that being said, there are a lot of different types of EQs out there, and even within each category of EQ, not all EQs are created equal, which is what we'll be examining in the next video. In the next video, we'll be taking a critical listen to different EQs of the same type to listen to the subtle differences that each one has and talk about why. And that wraps everything up for this video, so thanks for joining me for another episode of PSP University. For more information on PSPaudioware plugins, you can head over to PSPaudioware.com, and for more PSP University, you can subscribe down below.